Hello and welcome to another episode of Spectator TV. On this episode, we're going to be talking about Britain and free speech and hatred online. I am delighted to be joined by none other than Douglas Murray, our dear columnist, who has had a little bit of a taste of anti-free speech behaviour in the last few days, I think we can say. You are in America at the moment, Douglas.
I am.
I've been very struck by how many Americans are appalled at the limitations of free speech in Britain that we've seen in the days since the riots. We've seen judges very pompously sentencing people for writing often very shocking racist comments, but condemning them to prison for those comments. And to Americans, that seems very strange. Are you getting the same reaction from Americans you speak to?
Oh, yeah. I mean, people are amazed by it because, of course, in America, there's the protection of the First Amendment. And that has, by the way, a palpable effect on the discourse, including on the media discussion in the US, which is far less scared, I think, than most of the British media is, of dealing with, tricky people, difficult subjects. It is the case that the UK court system very often favors for instance, rich plaintiffs. The American media doesn't worry about that sort of thing nearly so much because of the First Amendment, freedom of speech protection, and it has a very clear impact across the society. Now, maybe there are some people in Britain who think this increasing policing of what people say is a good thing. I would just point out that nobody knows where the brakes are on that car, and all of the people celebrating this ridiculous behavior of the police and others in recent days should really consider what had happened if the boot was on the other foot. As you say, there are horrific and horrible things that people have passed around online. There are also things that are untrue. This, however, gets to something which is very interesting to me about the modern British political discourse, which is it never addresses primary problems. It always deals with reactive issues. When this appalling young man stabs 3 girls to death at a dance class, you can guess with complete accuracy that the British media, the British political class, will go on to some secondary or tertiary issue, usually to do with expression.
In that case, it would be that the concern was that the far right would leap on this as a kind of an example of illegal immigration, which of course it didn't turn out to be. But that was before even any details came out. The concern was that the far right would take this the wrong way before even the far right did.
But it's always like that. First of all, I mean, who is the organised far right in the UK? I mean, is there a British Nazi party? I don't see so. I think we saw it off the BNP 20 years ago. I think that actually one of the things that's happening, as I mentioned in my column, is that there is a genuine concern and an understandable concern from the authorities that these riots in recent weeks were actually not coordinated. They were ground up. They were not ordered by some Führer-like figure in the UK scene. They happened, and they happened out of obviously rage, and then led into, among other things, reprehensible criminality. But that's a much harder thing to deal with if you're dealing with a bottom-up expression of rage and rioting. That's very different from somebody ordering the rioting. So I think that this has caught the authorities off guard to a great extent. But this tendency to go, as I say, for things like let's police speech is just such a typically modern British thing. 2017, when the London Bridge attackers killed people on London Bridge and slashed the throats of pregnant women and much more. 3 men, by the way, who had no right to be in the UK. After that, if you remember, Theresa May and Sadiq Khan all stood together with a bunch of religious leaders and said that we must crack down on online discourse, which was sort of bewildering because there was no evidence. I mean, one of the guys at London Bridge appeared on a Channel 4 news program called My Neighbour the Jihadi. So it wasn't like he was, a sort of secretive figure who was lurking on online chat rooms. It's the same thing when Sir David Amess was killed. was murdered a couple of years ago. You'll remember the conversation was not even how can we keep MPs safer. It was about online harms bills, and the man who murdered Sir David Amess. There's no evidence that there was anything to do with an online harms issue. It's what the British police and political class think they can always come down on. Always come down on speech, always talk about the terrible internet, always talk about the terrible freedom of expression that people are exercising. I think it's a demonstration of their own failure to deal with primary issues and their own sort of eunuch-like status on so many things.
And I suppose it's sort of easy to police because there's always records of what's happened online, and you can always just go through someone's Twitter account. Any journalist can do it, so presumably any police officer can do it too.
Oh, absolutely. And it's the loveliest day's policing, of course, is to sit at your desk eating a digestive biscuit and a cup of coffee and scrolling through Twitter to find if a woman somewhere in Doncaster has liked something that she shouldn't have done on Twitter. I mean, as I mentioned in my column, and as I've rather banged on quite a lot about in recent years, there are huge numbers of police forces, by the way, particularly in the north of England, that have not solved one burglary in recent years. Not one. And as many homeowners have written to me and told me, they can even say to the police, I have CCTV of the burglars, and the police don't bother to look into it, and they don't prosecute anyone. These same forces are now rampaging through Twitter because it is so much easier for them.
Well, and certainly people I know in London who've experienced burglary, they say that they're very good at the pastoral side of things. So you get, a mental health person will come and talk to you about how you've been mentally affected by the burglary.
Yes.
But nobody looks into whether you...
Yes, but the best thing to say if you've been robbed is to tell them that you feel sad about it, amazingly enough, and sometimes feel very sad about it. But if you say, and I'd like my wallet back, they can't help. Such a shame.
Well, you mentioned that there isn't really an organised far right, and I think you're right about that. But I wonder what you made of that counter protest last week. Was it Wednesday or Thursday night last week? Which was all about. It was in reaction to this rumour that went around. There was going to be 100 far right riots in very improbable places like Walthamstow, and all these people came out to march against it. And it was then presented on the front pages of all the newspapers as a kind of expression of disgust at the far right that we're not really sure exists, but that was what the story was. Did you think that felt like something organised? Because there's a lot of conspiracy theorists on the right who think it was a kind of psy-op, as they call it.
It could well have been. It didn't need to be, but it could well have been. I mean, there are a bunch of groups in the UK who make their money from saying they are anti-fascist. By the way, all of these groups behave in very fascistic ways themselves, it should be noticed. But it's also always been the question that I've had in Britain, certainly since the destruction of the BNP, is who are you tilting against? Who are you running against? And the answer was, for a long time for these groups, was that the bogeyman of the far right had basically been certainly seen off from British politics. But what they did was they continued to raise money about it, continued to scare people about it, and moved the barrier of where far right should be said to be just further and further, closer and closer into the political mainstream. So that, for instance, these groups started to campaign against UKIP, against Nigel Farage, against the Brexit Party, against Reform. And then, of course, against individual Conservative MPs. Suella Braverman was meant to be a classic example for a while of the far-right Obersturmführer, jackboot-wearing, goose-stepping, typical skinhead. I mean, look at these people. They're a disgrace for whipping people up like this. And as for whipping up people in immigrant areas and others about the idea that there was some Nazi party of Great Britain about to... I mean, the problem with these people is that they are so hot for expressing bravery and their political... the beauty of their political thoughts by, for instance, being anti-Nazi. Sorry, guys, in the 1940s, it took bravery to be anti-Nazi. In the 1930s, it took bravery to be anti-Nazi. There is no bravery about it today. but they're fighting a sort of phantom bogeyman, and you can see they're desperate to have their cable street moment. They're desperate for that. These people, they have non parasan they hold up as if Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists might be just lurking around the corner and about to come and do a parade. It's preposterous, and among other things, it's also a complete double standard, because, as we all know, if you, for instance, write a piece about a terrorist who attended a certain mosque, you would never be allowed to, and nor should you, say that everyone at that mosque therefore is a terrorist. Oh, but if a white working class person is upset about anything, let alone a large number of white working class people, bang, far right, like that. No way to express anger, frustration, or anything else without being deemed to be far right. I think this is a big mistake that the political class and the media in the UK have made. And the media who've been willing to suck up to that should realize that all these people, all these fake anti-fascists, all of whom have very dubious histories themselves, all of these fake anti-fascist groups tilting at this fascist enemy are staggering around the land looking for fascists to identify. They will come for whoever is in their way and make these charges against them. They are totally unscrupulous. They are tin can waving money raisers and total frauds. And I wish more people called that out.
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, before we get ourselves into big trouble for saying unacceptable things, I hear what you're saying, that the far right is essentially a bogeyman that kind of unites the anti-fascist movement. But nevertheless, there were attempts to set fire to a hotel.
Yes,
there was an attack on a mosque. And these things are not pleasant. Let's just clarify for those people who think that you approve of these things.
Terrible.
That those are terrible things. Yeah.
Nobody could possibly condone behavior like that. It's completely reprehensible. Is it an expression of a political ideology? I doubt it. Is it a coherent right-left thing? I wouldn't think so. When governments and others badly let down the people in their country, there are always eruptions, and you have to deal with them. And I sort of would hope that the British government would, like any other government, and stop people being intimidated in their homes and much more. One of the problems about mobs is that they don't know how to behave, rather obviously, and they direct themselves onto just whatever is in front of them. But I mean, I think that this attempt to use that as a way to claim that Britain has some kind of organized far right is a real mistake. It's a category error. I think also it's just extremely unfair to people who are not violent, the ones who are not violent and never did anything violent, but are deeply worried about what has happened to their communities and their country. When obviously there is no place for the violence. What if you are anti the violence, but you desperately want to make your voice heard in some way? Are you allowed to even protest in the UK anymore without the Antifa groups claiming that you're a fascist for doing so? What are you allowed to do exactly if you're white and working class and live in an area like Southport and don't like some of the things that have gone on recently? What are you allowed to do? The answer is you're allowed to vote every 5 years. Great. And what's the result of that? Nothing for a quarter of a century. If you voted, for instance, against mass migration for a quarter of the century, you have voted and had your vote completely ignored. So the political class should not think that the great panacea to this is to say to people, once every 5 years, you're allowed to express yourself at the ballot box. There are lots of ways of expressing yourself. You and I happen to have the opportunity and platforms to do so, to speak, to write, and so on. Not everybody does. And I just deeply worry that now any political expression, online or off, by somebody who does not like the direction of their country is going to be deemed to be far right and part of this fascist movement that, as far as I can see, does not exist in the UK.
Do you think then there is a genuine victim mindset emerging among, it's an unfortunate phrase, but people use it, the white working class? Or do you think the white working class only know how to express themselves through the identity politics of saying, well, we have rights too, just like minorities do?
Well, I wrote in my column last week, it's just so sad what has been done to our country by Labour and by the Conservatives and by the Liberal Democrats. It is so sad. Look at the hopelessness that comes from joblessness. Everybody knows that. Everybody. This isn't a left-right issue. It is. You are living a hopeless life if you have no employment and have no means of employment, no likelihood of employment. And if you go through the stats, the unemployment stats for the areas of the north of England that we've all been reading about in recent weeks, these are areas where joblessness has increased among the native population over the last 13 years. Increased. These are areas where, to the extent that there has been any improvement in jobs and job availability, 3/4 of those jobs have gone to foreign-born workers. Now, this used to be, by the way, a left-wing issue as well. The left-wing trade unions used to be against the mass migration because they recognized that it pushed down the salaries of labor in the country. Well, when did you last hear any Labour politician representing any of these areas talking about that? They don't dare. They just leave these people behind. They actually abandon them. And they do nothing to improve their lives. And then on top of everything else, because of a few numbskulls who do reprehensible things and rioting, you're also far right if you just have a concern in these areas. I think it's appalling, the lack of just basic human empathy with people in these places. And Westminster seems to have no empathy for these people. And having abandoned them and ignored them, it now wants to spit in their faces as well.
Well, and it seems to be almost a class thing, but also a kind of intellectual thing. So you could be a highbrow. I mean, I know we'll get onto this in a second. You people went after you at the weekend for an interview that you did, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in your column this week, you talk about how if there's a sort of impression among the left liberal establishment that you are a bit thick and a bit poor and you're saying terrible things online, then we can come after you. But they don't. They're more nervous about doing it with people who are in a position to defend themselves. They go after the most vulnerable with the online abuse stuff.
Well, I think that's, as I quoted my column this week, as Rowan Atkinson said, this is rather to be expected, that people with a platform and the ability to defend themselves will do so. And people without much of a platform, with no ability to defend themselves and no defenders in the public square, will be just left by the wayside. I mean, you have seen a few people, complete dolts like Jonathan Freedland of The Guardian, talking about the necessity of, I think, extraditing Elon Musk to the UK.
Yeah.
Good luck with that, guys. Good luck with that. It's pathetic. Again, these people, they have no interest in the primary problems, but they'll come down on their tough on Elon Musk, tough on the causes of Elon Musk columns. I've had a bit of it. It's water off a duck's back, of course, but a few sort of rampaging online lunatics like Alistair Campbell have tried to say that I should be in trouble because I predicted all this.
Yes.
And have said so. And that's pretty remarkable, actually. Of course, as Thomas Sowell famously said, people will forgive you for being wrong, but they'll never forgive you for being right. And I was right on mass migration and integration, and Alistair Campbell was flat out wrong. He was part of the Labour government that put massive boosters under the legal and illegal immigration into the UK in the late 90s and early 2000s. He was part of the Blair government that did that. It's quite extraordinary to see somebody like him who caused these challenges and problems to our country trying to crack down on the people who noticed it. Really, I mean, if he wasn't such a sick individual, it would be funny.
But I mean, let's just clarify for people who might not have followed this. It was an interview that you gave in November that was chiefly passed around, and you were talking about in October, last year, and you were talking about Hamas protesters, pro-Hamas protesters, chiefly, were you not?
Yeah, and Hamas leaders, more importantly, in the UK, because what people don't seem to realise is that terrorist leaders and others, including the former Deputy Prime Minister of Iran, live in the UK. This is something that astonishes me, and the British authorities have done nothing about. You can call for the murder of a British novelist, and the British novelist is unsafe, Salman Rushdie, but the person who called for his murder lives perfectly safely in the UK. What? Why does the UK allow the former Hamas military leader to live in the UK? What's he brought the country? And that's the point I made last October. And a few totally either ignorant or very stupid people picked it up and said that I'd said this about the recent riots and was saying this about all immigrants. I mean, it was so preposterous. But, all these people who talk about fake news and disinformation, you can set your watch. They're all people who pass around disinformation like that themselves. That's what people like Alistair Campbell have spent the last week doing, Kenan Malik of The Observer, all these characters who talk about disinformation and the importance of truth. They pass around disinformation all the time. They've done it about me in recent days. They're such hypocrites and hacks. Fortunately, I don't think they have any impact, actually, outside of their own deranged circles of friends. Well, friends such as they have, I'm sure.
I mean, you faced a few Twitter storms in your life, I think it's fair to say. Where would you rank this on the scale of Twitter storms that you've faced?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't really care about storms unless they're real. I take very little interest in what people say about me online, because if I did take an interest about it, I wouldn't get any work done.
Yes.
No, I mean, Twitter storms are just one of those things that come and go, and that I suppose a writer has to just accept them. But I'm much more worried about the reality. I'm much more worried about the reality in Britain, that, everything that was promised to the voters, they've been let down. And this recent terrible riots and things will just give the political class, as far as I can see, an excuse to further ignore the troubles in our country.
But the reason I ask about Twitter storms is not just puerile interest, although there's a bit of that, but it's that Elon Musk now runs X, Twitter, and it is now such a hated platform, and yet it is still the platform that informs the public conversation more than any other.
It's the number one news source in the world.
Yes. And people are...
Well, that's annoying for the BBC and co, isn't it?
People can't bear it. And I wonder what you think is going to happen there, because let's say Kamala Harris wins in November, which is not unfeasible. Keir Starmer in Britain, other governments may decide that they need to shut down Twitter, X, Elon Musk, because he is poisoning the discourse.
Yeah, they've tried this sort of thing for years, as I say. They always focus on the response and the speech, and not on the things that people are responding to and speaking about. Absolutely guaranteed. If you want to solve some of the problems that America is going through, you stop the movement of millions of illegal migrants into the US across the southern border. If you want to address the real problems going on in the US, you do that. You address the economy. You tackle inflation. Same thing in the UK. If you want to solve the problems in the UK, you stop having historically high net legal and illegal migration. You grow the economy. You tackle inflation. You make sure that the money in people's wallets goes further than it is at the moment. These are not impossible challenges. The borders not an impossible challenge at all. Straightforward. We used to have borders. We used to have them. And so some of these ones are not that difficult. Some are relatively difficult. Inflation's relatively difficult to get under control, but you can. We could have a sensible energy policy, for instance, in the US and UK. That would do an enormous amount to bring down the inflation. But these things are harder. All of them are harder than saying, Twitter, X, Elon Musk. It's just, and we shouldn't allow the politicians to get away with that. I just don't think we should. We shouldn't allow them to get away with continuously diverting us from their failure to tackle the things we have tasked them with tackling.
Ultimately, is it nobody really cares about rhetoric?
I think very little. I mean, as a devotee of the art myself, I regret this fact. But no, I mean, it's not about the speech. It's about the facts. It's about the facts. You could silence every single person in Hartlepool. You could ban anyone in Southport from being allowed to use social media. And you still wouldn't have stopped the boats coming over every day of smuggling gangs bringing in illegals into the UK who should not be there and have no right to be there. These people in charge are so dishonest to keep on tackling not the sources of their own failure, but other people's objection to that failure.
Douglas Murray, I think we'll end it there. But sadly, Alistair Campbell didn't join us today, but I'm sure we'll get him on.
I'm told he's doing one of those things where he goes around rapaciously bullying people and then says that he feels sad himself, and so nobody must criticize him. Brilliant 1-2 punch for that. It's a great bit of narcissistic manipulation.
Can't be beaten. It can't be beaten.
Can't be.
Douglas, thank you very much for joining Spectator TV. I hope to speak to you soon.